When the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant, it wasn't for a war criminal or dictator. It was for Israel's former defense minister. The man who once commanded one of the world's most powerful militaries now faces charges that could land him in The Hague. But here's the twist. The accusations aren't about battlefield decisions. What secret words on global TV sealed his fate? The accusations hinge on a courtroom drama over siege tactics, not battlefield bullets. What could possibly drive international prosecutors to target a defense official? The answer involves a legal battle testing whether military ministers can slip past The Hague. But first, we need to understand the man at the center of this unprecedented case. Gallant started as a paratrooper in 1977, jumping out of planes while most people his age worried about college exams. He carved his path through Israel's military hierarchy with surgical precision, leading operations during the Second Intifada and earning his reputation through decades of night raids and counter-terrorism operations that shaped Israel's defense doctrine. The transformation from decorated general to defense minister happened in 2022 when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appointed him to oversee the entire Israeli military apparatus. Intelligence briefings crossed his desk daily. Military budgets required his approval. Strategic operations needed his signature. This wasn't just another promotion. It was control over one of the world's most advanced military machines. October 7th changed everything. When Hamas launched its surprise attack, killing over 1,200 Israelis, Gallant found himself orchestrating Israel's response. The man who had spent decades fighting smaller-scale operations now managed a full-scale war as rocket barrages fell on Israeli cities and hostages disappeared into Gaza's tunnel networks. Then came the soundbite that prosecutors called a confession. We will cut off electricity, fuel, and food supplies to Gaza's entire population. These weren't classified military orders. They were public declarations broadcast on television and recorded for posterity. The measured military professional had begun using language that would later haunt him in court. Military experts noticed the change immediately. Daniel Levy, a former Israeli peace negotiator, observed that Gallant's rhetoric went beyond typical wartime leadership. The defense minister wasn't just describing military tactics. He was outlining collective punishment strategies that international law specifically prohibits. His statement suggested a deliberate policy to make civilian life unbearable in Gaza. The siege tactics Gallant implemented reflected his military mindset applied to an entire population. Civilian infrastructure collapsed under his orders as water treatment facilities lost power. Hospitals ran out of fuel for generators, and food convoys waited at checkpoints while civilians went hungry. These weren't accidental byproducts of warfare. They appeared to be calculated pressure tactics designed to force Hamas's surrender through civilian suffering. Turns out, even defense ministers can't just swipe left on international law. Documentation of Gallant's orders began accumulating in real time. Military communications revealed coordination between different branches of Israel's defense establishment. Satellite imagery captured the systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure. Aid organizations recorded the deliberate blocking of humanitarian supplies. The evidence trail grew longer each day. The siege continued. International observers started connecting dots between Gallant's public statements and military actions on the ground. His October 9th declaration about imposing a complete siege on Gaza wasn't just tough talk. It was a blueprint being executed by thousands of soldiers under his command. The defense minister had essentially confessed to implementing collective punishment on live television. Legal experts recognized the significance immediately. William Shabas, a professor of international law, noted that military leaders rarely provide such clear evidence of their intentions. Gallant's own words eliminated the prosecution's biggest challenge, proving criminal intent. The defense minister had documented his strategy in real time through press conferences and media interviews. The International Criminal Court began collecting evidence within weeks of the October attacks. Prosecutors didn't need to rely on witness testimony or circumstantial evidence. They had video recordings of Gallant explaining his siege tactics. They had satellite data showing the implementation of his orders. They had documentation of the humanitarian crisis that followed his decisions. Former Israeli military officials expressed concern about Gallant's public statements. Retired General Amnon Reshef warned that military leaders needed to consider international legal implications of their public rhetoric. The defense minister's words weren't just domestic political messaging. They were creating evidence for future prosecutions. By early 2024, the evidence against Gallant had reached critical mass. The same decisive nature that made him an effective general had provided prosecutors with a roadmap to his alleged crimes. But prosecutors still needed to prove something crucial: that his military decisions had crossed a very specific legal line. When strategy becomes crime, at the heart of this case lies one question: did Gallant cross the line from tactical pressure into war crime? International law strictly forbids starving civilians or punishing entire populations. The Geneva Conventions established these boundaries in 1949 after witnessing the horrors of World War II. Military commanders can target enemy forces and military infrastructure. They cannot deliberately starve civilian populations or destroy essential services that keep people alive. The ICC exists to prosecute leaders who cross this line. Prosecutor Karim Khan argued that Gallant's siege tactics violated multiple international treaties. The ICC alleges he used starvation as a weapon, plain and simple. These aren't abstract legal theories. They're binding international laws that define criminal conduct during warfare. Khan's team built their case around documented violations of these established principles. The siege began with precision and calculation. Israeli forces cut electricity to Gaza's power plant within hours of Gallant's orders. Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, described operating rooms going dark during surgeries when generators ran out of fuel. Water pumping stations stopped functioning without power. Sewage treatment facilities shut down. Food imports stopped at Israeli checkpoints. Aid trucks carrying medical supplies waited for days at border crossings. The Israeli military controlled every supply line into Gaza and used that control to implement Gallant's siege strategy. Legal experts immediately recognized the implications. Professor Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestinian rights, explained that blockade strategies become collective punishment when they target entire populations rather than military objectives. The siege affected Gaza's 2.3 million residents regardless of their connection to Hamas. International humanitarian law specifically prohibits this type of indiscriminate punishment. The prosecution's case gained strength from Gallant's own statements during the siege's early days. He announced on October 9th that Israel would cut off electricity, fuel, and food supplies to Gaza. These public declarations eliminated prosecutors' need to prove intent through circumstantial evidence. The defense minister had articulated his strategy on television and radio interviews broadcast worldwide. Israeli military officials privately expressed concern about Gallant's public rhetoric. Retired Colonel Daniel Reisner warned that such statements could create legal liability under international law. Former Mossad Director Tamir Pardo noted that military operations required more careful public messaging to avoid criminal exposure. Their warnings proved prophetic when ICC prosecutors cited Gallant's statements as evidence of criminal intent. The specific charges against Gallant reflect the systematic nature of the alleged crimes. The ICC accused him of using starvation as a weapon of war by deliberately restricting food supplies to Gaza's civilian population. The crimes against humanity charges focus on the collective punishment aspects of the siege. Prosecutors argue these weren't battlefield decisions, but calculated policies designed to inflict suffering on non-combatants. International humanitarian law distinguishes between legitimate military pressure and criminal collective punishment based on targeting and intent. Military forces can pressure enemy combatants through tactical operations. They cannot deliberately starve civilian populations to achieve military objectives. The prosecution argues that Gallant's siege crossed this boundary by targeting essential civilian services rather than military capabilities. Medical records from Gaza's hospitals showed increased mortality rates during the siege period. Children's malnutrition cases rose dramatically after food restrictions began. Hospital admissions for waterborne diseases increased when sewage treatment systems failed. These health statistics corroborated witness testimonies about the siege's impact on civilian welfare. The ICC's investigation revealed how modern siege warfare operates through infrastructure targeting rather than traditional military encirclement. Gallant's strategy used Israel's control over Gaza's borders to restrict essential supplies. This approach created military pressure through civilian suffering rather than direct combat operations. Prosecutors argue this methodology constitutes collective punishment prohibited under international law. But proving these allegations required more than legal theory. Prosecutors needed concrete evidence that could withstand international scrutiny. The evidence trail ICC prosecutors spent 18 months building their case like forensic investigators at a crime scene. The most striking evidence came from intercepted communications on October 12th, showing Gallant's office coordinating with border control units about restricting medical supplies. The message specified which types of medicine could enter Gaza and which should be blocked at checkpoints. Another communication from October 15th revealed discussions about maintaining fuel restrictions to prevent hospital generators from operating at full capacity. Satellite imagery and intercepted communications both mapped the systematic siege in devastating detail. European Space Agency satellites captured high-resolution images showing power stations, water treatment facilities, and communication towers being systematically targeted. Analysis revealed that civilian infrastructure suffered more damage than military installations during the first month of operations. Meanwhile, Israeli military networks generated thousands of messages daily during the Gaza operations, with intelligence agencies intercepting communications that revealed coordination between different branches of Israel's military establishment. Doctors, aid workers, journalists, and even some anonymous IDF officers painted a clear picture of deliberate civilian hardship. Dr. Mohammed Abu Salmiya, director of Al-Shifa Hospital, provided detailed testimony about medical shortages during the siege period. He described performing surgeries without anesthesia when medical supplies ran out. His testimony included photographs of overcrowded hospital wards and patients lying on floors due to equipment failures. Aid workers from Doctors Without Borders corroborated his accounts with their own documentation of medical emergencies. Military briefings revealed the most incriminating evidence against Gallant's defense strategy. Routine briefings to Israeli government officials contained discussions about using civilian suffering as military pressure. Transcripts showed Gallant explaining how restrictions on food and fuel would force Hamas to negotiate. These briefings treated civilian hardship as a strategic tool rather than an unfortunate consequence of military operations. Audio recordings from government meetings captured Gallant's strategic thinking in unfiltered detail. He discussed the siege's psychological impact on Gaza's population during security cabinet sessions. The recordings showed calculated decision-making about humanitarian restrictions rather than emotional battlefield responses.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
Prosecutors argued these recordings demonstrated premeditated criminal intent. Documentary evidence from humanitarian organizations strengthened the prosecution's case significantly. The World Food Program documented systematic blocking of food convoys at Israeli checkpoints. UNICEF recorded increased child mortality rates during the siege period. The International Committee of the Red Cross reported deliberate interference with medical evacuations. These organizations provided institutional credibility to individual witness testimonies. Internal Israeli military documents obtained through intelligence sources revealed policy frameworks behind the siege tactics. Orders from Gallant's office established procedures for evaluating humanitarian aid requests. The documents showed approval processes designed to delay rather than facilitate civilian relief efforts. Military units received specific instructions about maintaining pressure through resource restrictions. Banking records revealed financial aspects of the siege strategy that prosecutors had not initially anticipated. Israeli authorities froze Palestinian banking assets and restricted money transfers into Gaza. These financial restrictions complemented the physical siege by preventing civilians from purchasing available supplies. The combination created what prosecutors termed a comprehensive collective punishment system designed to inflict maximum civilian hardship through coordinated military and economic pressure. The evidence created an unusually complete picture of command responsibility and criminal intent. Prosecutors possessed communications showing orders, satellite imagery documenting implementation, and witness testimonies describing consequences. But perhaps the most damning proof came directly from Gallant himself, on his own Twitter feed. Israel's legal defense. Israel's lawyers struck first, arguing the ICC had no business here. But was that a legal masterstroke or a smokescreen? The Israeli government argued that the court lacked authority to prosecute Israeli officials because Israel never ratified the Rome Statute. Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara filed formal objections claiming the ICC overstepped its legal boundaries by investigating a non-member state. Israeli lawyers contended that only Israeli courts could prosecute Israeli military officials for actions taken during defensive operations. The jurisdiction argument created immediate complications for international prosecutors. Israel's legal position rested on established principles of state sovereignty and domestic legal systems. Israeli military operations occurred within established protocols reviewed by military attorneys and government legal advisors. The Israel Defense Forces maintained its own military advocate general who evaluated operational legality in real time. Israeli officials argued this internal oversight system satisfied international legal requirements. Israeli defense attorneys argued that Hamas transformed civilian infrastructure into military targets through their operational strategy. Take Gaza's hospitals. Israeli intelligence claimed they concealed tunnel entrances and command centers beneath patient wards. Israeli lawyers claimed these dual-use targets became legitimate military objectives under international humanitarian law when the military advantage outweighed civilian harm. Military operations experts testified that Hamas deliberately embedded military assets within civilian infrastructure to create legal complications for Israeli forces. Former Israeli military advocate General Daniel Reisner explained that international law permits attacking dual-use facilities under specific circumstances. Israeli legal teams argued that Gallant's siege tactics targeted legitimate military objectives rather than punishing civilian populations. Israel says it had every right to cripple Gaza after a deadly surprise attack. Israeli attorneys cited October 7th as the deadliest attack on Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. Israeli legal experts argued that defensive measures taken after such an assault could not constitute criminal acts under international law. The siege tactics aim to prevent future attacks rather than punish Gaza's population. Israeli legal scholars challenged the ICC's application of international humanitarian law to asymmetric warfare scenarios. Professor Yuval Shani from Hebrew University argued that traditional legal frameworks developed for conventional warfare poorly addressed conflicts involving non-state actors embedded within civilian populations. Israeli defense teams claimed the ICC applied double standards not used against other military forces facing similar operational challenges. Evidence of Hamas war crimes strengthened Israel's defensive strategy significantly. Israeli intelligence provided documentation of Hamas using hospitals as command centers and schools as weapons storage facilities. Video evidence showed Hamas fighters launching rockets from residential neighborhoods and using ambulances for military transport. Israeli lawyers argued that Hamas violations justified Israeli countermeasures under the doctrine of military necessity. Diplomatic pressure accompanied Israel's legal defense through multiple international channels. Israeli officials contacted allied governments to challenge ICC legitimacy and funding. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office coordinated with congressional leaders to propose sanctions against ICC officials investigating Israeli actions. The diplomatic campaign aimed to isolate the ICC politically while challenging its authority legally. The United States provided crucial diplomatic support, despite not being an ICC member itself. American officials threatened to impose sanctions on ICC personnel investigating Israeli or American military actions. Congressional leaders introduced legislation to restrict funding for international organizations cooperating with ICC investigations of allied nations. This diplomatic support reinforced Israel's argument that the prosecution represented political rather than legal action. European allies created unexpected complications for Israel's diplomatic strategy. Several European Union member states expressed support for ICC jurisdiction despite their close relationships with Israel. German officials noted their obligation to arrest ICC warrant holders, regardless of political considerations. French authorities indicated they would comply with international arrest warrants if Israeli officials entered their territory. Israel's refusal to cooperate with ICC investigations created unintended consequences for their legal defense. The court interpreted non-cooperation as admission of guilt rather than jurisdictional challenge. ICC prosecutors argued that innocent parties would provide evidence to clear their names rather than obstructing international investigations. Israel's stance eliminated opportunities to present exculpatory evidence or challenge prosecution witnesses directly. The legal battle had transformed from jurisdictional challenge into something far more significant. The outcome would establish whether military superpowers could shield their officials from international prosecution through non-cooperation and diplomatic pressure. But this wasn't just about one arrest warrant anymore. The precedent that changes everything never before had The Hague aimed its sights at a defense minister from a military superpower until now. Previous cases targeted African warlords, Balkan war criminals, and dictators from smaller nations. The Gallant warrant shattered this pattern completely. For the first time, prosecutors targeted a senior official from a technologically advanced military operating under democratic oversight. The precedent created immediate shockwaves through defense establishments worldwide. Military leaders across the globe began reassessing their operational procedures within hours of the warrant's announcement. Western democracies found themselves in particularly uncomfortable positions. Pentagon officials held emergency meetings about potential exposure for American defense secretaries involved in overseas operations. British Ministry of Defense lawyers reviewed combat authorization procedures for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. French military attorneys examined rules of engagement for operations in Mali and other African deployments. The precedent forced every major military power to confront their vulnerability to international prosecution. Human rights groups celebrated while military lawyers expressed alarm. Amnesty International declared the warrant a historic step toward universal justice, regardless of national power or political influence. Human Rights Watch praised prosecutors for applying international law equally to all nations, rather than exempting military superpowers from accountability. But former Pentagon General Counsel William Haines warned that personal criminal liability would paralyze military decision-making during crisis situations. Defense officials needed rapid response capabilities during active conflicts rather than extensive legal consultations for every tactical choice. International law professors split dramatically over the case's broader implications. Professor David Crane from Syracuse University argued that the warrant represented essential progress toward universal application of humanitarian law. Military leaders from powerful nations had operated with practical immunity for decades, while officials from weaker countries faced prosecution for similar actions. Other legal scholars warned about dangerous precedents for national sovereignty and military effectiveness. Professor John Yoo from UC Berkeley argued that the warrant undermined legitimate self-defense rights by subjecting military decisions to international political review. Countries with active military operations monitored the case with increasing anxiety about their own potential exposure. Russian officials noted the irony of Western support for international prosecution while conducting their own military operations globally. Chinese military leaders observed how ICC precedents might apply to their territorial disputes and internal security operations. The warrant created diplomatic complications for nations that simultaneously supported international justice while conducting military operations abroad. The chilling effect on military decision-making became apparent almost immediately. Pentagon lawyers now vet strike orders in real time, transforming split-second battlefield decisions into lengthy legal consultations. Combat commanders request written legal opinions for tactical choices during active operations. Military attorneys find themselves involved in real-time battlefield decisions rather than post-operation reviews. The legal uncertainty slows military responsiveness during time-sensitive operations. Allied nations faced uncomfortable diplomatic positions regarding arrest obligations under ICC membership treaties. European allies maintained close security relationships with Israel while holding legal obligations to enforce international arrest warrants. The contradiction forced governments to choose between diplomatic relationships and international law compliance. Some nations quietly indicated they would avoid situations requiring arrest decisions, while others publicly affirmed their legal obligations. The precedent threatened to either revolutionize international accountability or destroy ICC credibility permanently. Successful prosecution would establish that military superpowers face the same legal standards as smaller nations. Failed prosecution would demonstrate that powerful countries could ignore international law through non-cooperation and diplomatic pressure. Will this warning from The Hague reshape battlefield decisions forever or fizzle under political pressure? The answer depends on how this unprecedented legal challenge plays out. Gallant's case tests whether international law can hold military superpowers accountable in the modern era. Either the ICC establishes universal accountability, regardless of national power, or powerful nations demonstrate they can ignore international law through diplomatic pressure and non-cooperation. Defense establishments worldwide now face unprecedented uncertainty about criminal exposure for operational decisions. Military leaders must balance tactical effectiveness against potential prosecution by international tribunals. The outcome will reshape how military commanders approach combat operations permanently. If you found this legal thriller gripping, hit subscribe and let us know what you think. Can international courts really tame the world's armies? Don't forget to like the video and see you next time on Crime Republic.